There's something very special about making food traditionally, and I'll use sourdough bread as an example. Sourdough bread is obviously and we can dive in deep, but a completely different food than other breads for a lot of very, very important reasons. One of the things that it does, in addition to providing all sorts of health benefits over more commercial bread, is that it brings in the sense of terroir. If you talk about terroir in the wine industry, because vines that are growing in Argentina and the growing conditions in the soils and the climate are different than they are in, say, Napa, even with the same vines, it would produce wines of different quality that are reminiscent of terroir, that sense of place. People are only talking about terroir with wine. Other than that, in the modern food system, we celebrate uniformity. We celebrate the fact that you can get a McDonald's hamburger in New York City and a McDonald's hamburger in Tokyo and they taste exactly the same. Or you can get Budweiser all over the world and it tastes exactly the same. I mean, it is an act of incredible precision and technology to be able to produce the exact same food in different parts of the world. It's not something we should celebrate. What we should celebrate, again, is the fact that all traditional food provides that sense of terroir, that sense of place in so many different ways. And one of the ways that it does that is because the foundation of almost every traditional diet I've ever found around the world is fermentation. Fermenting dairy, fermenting vegetables, fermenting meat, fermenting sugars and alcohol, fermenting grains, all of these things. The colonies of wild bacteria and yeast that exist in different places are different, and they produce different qualities. So even if I made the same exact loaf of sourdough bread here in Maryland, and you made a loaf of sourdough bread using the same recipe and even the same flour in San Francisco, there'd be little differences, and that's something we should really celebrate. Years ago, the researchers went out and collected bread from different sourdough bakeries all over the world, and they tested the bread and wanted to see if they could look at that and identify the bakery that the bread came from by the colonies of bacteria and yeast, and they could. But what they found was something even deeper. They not only could identify the bakery, because of the colonies of bacteria and yeast present in that bread, they could identify it down to the baker. The bacteria and yeast that are literally on the skin of individual bakers' hands impacted the bread enough that they could identify it under a microscope. But what was even more beautiful, when they looked deeper, they could tell that it was a symbiotic relationship. Wild bacteria and yeast that was on the bread was also impacting the microflora on the skin of the baker. I mean, it was a give and take. To me, that's beautiful. That's what real food is all about.
In a sense, the sourdough process is more about making that grain bioavailable to you, not necessarily about you getting a culture into your diet, right?
The benefits of true sourdough bread are many. That sense of terroir and that sense of tradition and all that are there for sure. For people who are thinking about trying sourdough bread or are in the process of consuming sourdough bread or any of this, please pay very close attention, because what I'm about to say is typically missed in a conversation about sourdough bread. First off, what makes sourdough bread different than any other bread? It is produced through a combination of two different fermentations. So there's a yeast fermentation and a simultaneous bacterial fermentation. The oldest bread we know of in the world right now is a little less than 9,000 years old. The entirety of the time bread was made, from then until the mid-1800s, all bread was sourdough. Like, it was by default sourdough. If you were harnessing the wild yeast from the air to leaven the bread, to make the bread rise, you automatically got the wild bacteria as well. By the way, same thing with beer. Up until the mid-1800s, beer was a sour beer. Beer was sour until you intentionally in a lab took yeast strains out and just kept those yeast strains alive by themselves and stuck them in the beer, stuck them in the bread, and just, you have both of these fermentations happening at the same time. This is the traditional way of making bread and the traditional way of making beer. Now, the yeast fermentation produces two things: carbon dioxide, which makes the bread rise, and alcohol. So if you're making beer, you want both the alcohol and the carbon dioxide, right? But in the bread, you get a little bit of alcohol, but that burns off, and it's very minuscule anyhow, because the fermentation is nowhere near as long as it is for making beer. But the production of that carbon dioxide is what makes that bread rise. The fact that that yeast is wild really doesn't make a difference, because if you bought Fleischmann's yeast off the grocery store shelves, it's going to produce the same effect. The bread's going to rise. The important part of the sourdough is the bacterial fermentation. Now, these are wild strains of bacteria, so they're the ones that are native to where you live. They're in the air right now. I mean, you can't see them in front of me, but they're between you and me. They're on my skin. They're on the table. They're on the flour. They're everywhere. When they start fermenting, they are doing many, many things. One of the things that they're doing is that they are eating the available sugars that are in the grains. The byproduct of that is lactic acid. They are chemically and physically transforming grains, which are not meant for human consumption. Grains are the babies of the plant, whether it's a wheat plant or rye, whatever. And there's a lot of energy being put into making sure that these babies can stay dormant until they're in the right conditions to sprout and make new life. So phytates, lectins, all sorts of nasty things are there. Well, the fermentation process helps to detoxify and mitigate the issues related to things like phytates and lectins. And so they're detoxifying the grains. They're also pre-digesting the grains so that the nutrients are more easily available to our bodies. This is all fantastic. Plus, and this is really, really important, two very important things are happening. One is the carbohydrate load is decreasing because that's the food for the bacteria, and there's a drop in pH. It's becoming more acidic. And as that happens, as the pH drops, if it gets to, so important, 4.6 pH, so 7 is neutral. When it gets down to 4.6, it activates an enzyme that starts breaking down the gluten even further. And this is so very important because you have to reach that 4.6 pH to really transform the gluten into something that our bodies can tolerate. And all the flavors and the aromas come from the bacterial fermentation. At the end of this, a sourdough loaf compared to a yeasted loaf has these qualities. It smells amazing. It looks amazing. It tastes amazing. The gluten for many of us is either more tolerable or fully tolerable, depending on different makeups of us. I will tell you, our sourdough bread, and people are not going to believe this, but this is 100% true. As of this past month, we just identified our 7th medically identified celiac customer who is absolutely fine on our bread. Now, we have multiple customers who are celiac that are not fine on our bread. And celiac is a spectrum, right? But we have medically identified celiac customers, 7 we know of, absolutely fine on our bread. And I know we have one that's an 85-year-old woman. She eats a slice of our bread every day. And I'm not suggesting you're supposed to eat a slice of bread every day, but what I'm suggesting is a loaf of sourdough bread is a completely different food than other breads. It also has a lower glycemic index. Glycemic index 0 to 100. 100 is pure glucose, our blood sugar response to this. Any bread, any regular modern loaf of bread, I don't care if it is, 100% white Wonder Bread or Petridge Farm multi-berry, whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. They all fall in the high range of glycemic index. So that means we have a huge blood sugar response spike when we consume that bread. Same exact ingredients, but put through a sourdough process, drops it through the middle range down into the low range. Our blood sugar response to that bread, just because the sourdough process is completely different than it is if it's not sourdough. But here's the problem. You need to understand this. There is no FDA regulation anywhere in this country. And in fact, in most countries, there are no governmental regulations, oversight, things you have to meet, requirements to call something sourdough. You can call anything sourdough. If I'm fermenting this bread properly, it means I am literally babysitting trillions of wild bacteria and yeast, dealing with all sorts of different variables like temperature and humidity and all these other things, trying to make this work over a very long period of time. Or I could just get commercial yeast and do it and make another loaf of bread. So obviously that's what most of the food industry is doing. But what they're doing for the sourdough, they understand that the customer expectation of sourdough is that it's going to taste sour. So they make a regular yeasted bread with none of the health benefits I just talked about and put in something that's sour, acetic acid, lactic acid, or citric acid. And it tastes sour. They slap a label on it that says sourdough bread because they're allowed to do that. All of a sudden, somebody watching something on TikTok or hearing that maybe sourdough bread is better, they go in the regular grocery store, buy a loaf of sourdough bread. Hell, it can even be over by the deli area in a brown package and away from the other bread. And it can cost more. And they bring it home and they see no differences with it. And that's because it isn't any different. It's the same exact thing with some acid put into it. The key is turn over the package of sourdough bread, and if it says anything acidic, lactic acid, citric acid, acetic acid, which is also vinegar, sometimes it's vinegar, if you still want it, get it, but it's not sourdough bread. The other thing that's happening a lot in the sourdough world, and even from respected websites, there's recipes for all sourdough anything, and you can make anything sourdough. All of our pasta sourdough, our pastries are sourdough, our croissants are sourdough, our cookies are sourdough. Everything we do here is fully sourdough. But a lot of these recipes for these other things, what they've done is they've taken a basic recipe. So let's say they're chocolate chip sourdough cookies. They take like a Toll House chocolate chip cookie recipe and slap in a little bit of sourdough mother, mix it all up and put it on a tray, put it in the oven and bake it. The problem is the 2 cups of flour that you added to those cookies never had time to ferment. They've never been through that chemical and physical changes produced by that fermentation. It's never reached the pH of 4.6 or below. All you did is slap in a little bit of sourdough mother. You've called it sourdough. Maybe you've added a little bit of nuance of some kind of flavor. Essentially, you've literally just made Toll House cookies with a little bit of sourdough mother in it. In order to do any of those things, and this is one of the things we spent many, many years working on, once you've introduced the bacteria and yeast through that sourdough mother, you have to give it time to ferment. I don't care if it's a chocolate chip cookie or sourdough pasta, so that those flours go through that process and get safer and more nourishing.
If you enjoyed the clip from the podcast, make sure to check out the next video up here, or head over to watch the full episode down here. And before you go, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Come on. Yeah, thanks for watching.